how many of you have heard of postmodernism and deconstruction? Like most of you have heard the terminology, right? What does deconstruct mean? When you hear deconstruct, like, what do you take that to mean?
Break down.
Okay. So the way it is used is not the way that the inventor of the term intended it to be used. So when people say deconstruct, mostly in the culture, when people are on Twitter or on YouTube or on the news, they say deconstruct, they mainly mean interpret really hard. And that isn't what it is. Now, I think you can live a perfectly rich and interesting life without knowing any of the stuff I'm going to tell you. I think it helps to understand some of the basic concepts, because David Foster Wallace was a guy who had a background in philosophy. He was very interested in postmodernism, poststructuralist theory. He wrote about it himself, and he wrote fiction that you can see as being part of that tradition, or as being a response to that tradition, or as being a refutation of that tradition. Now, if you're just kind of coming in from outside the English department, or you're, a sophomore or freshman, and you haven't heard a lot of these terms, it's totally fine. It doesn't mean you're ignorant or any of that stuff. This is all very rarefied terminology, but I've watched over the past 10 years as this stuff has leaked out into the broader culture, and depending on where you stand, affected or infected the larger conversations. So I want to give you guys a handle on some of this. If we're going to talk about postmodernism, if we're going to talk about poststructuralism, we have to talk about the movements that these things are post. Well, if there's postmodernism, then what is modernism? If there's poststructuralism, what is structuralism? Okay. So one of the main post-structuralist theorists, a guy named Jacques Derrida, said that this thing happens at the end of the 19th century that creates a rupture between the 18th century Enlightenment, where, the age of reason, the age of rejection of religion, rejection of superstition, the age also of revolution. You have the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution. People are resisting at the end of the 18th century colonial powers. But Derrida says that this radical democracy and this radical enlightenment produces four men who create a rupture between the 19th and 20th centuries. You can probably guess who they are. I probably have talked about this a little bit. So they're Freud, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Marx. From Freud, we get a critique of the self. Now, Freud is sort of out of fashion perennially, and then he comes back into fashion. The thing about Freud, the thing about all these guys, you don't have to agree with what they say. I think it's important to understand the significance, because Freud invented psychology, right? And if you say, well, he doesn't get it right, well, that's no doubt true, but he just comes up with it. He comes up with the notion of the unconscious.
Wasn't he the father of psychology?
Father of psychology, psychiatry. He needs an idea of the mind working in two different ways. So he's like, okay, well, things that we process rationally are the consciousness, then all the other stuff is the unconsciousness. Now, whether that is true or not remains to be seen. Many neuroscientists don't believe that there is such a thing as a consciousness and unconsciousness. They think it's a metaphor, right? There's not a part of the brain that is like, here's your unconsciousness and this is your consciousness over here. Neuroscientists disagree with this. So Freud changes the way people from the 19th to the 20th century think about the self. Darwin changes the way Western civilization thinks about nature. Nietzsche, the German philosopher, changes the way intellectuals think about God. Famously, in a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra, it's kind of a novel, right? In a weird kind of way. It's kind of a philosophical novel, and there's a character named Zarathustra, and he becomes enlightened, and then he interacts with the townspeople. And so Zarathustra, this character, says a number of things that Nietzsche might not have believed. Famously, Zarathustra, in Nietzsche's book, says, God is dead. And then he goes on to say, and we have killed him. Now, Nietzsche is not talking about literally God not existing. He's talking about that there is this thing that happens in Western civilization when people become thoroughly rational, people become empirical, people become scientific, there's a falling away from the church, and people begin to apply scientific and Aristotelian principles to Christianity or other faiths, right? So Nietzsche is not celebrating God being, quote, dead. He's diagnosing this thing that has happened in the culture, right? He's not saying that there still aren't Christians. He's not even saying that God doesn't exist. He's saying something very specific. Hippies got a hold of this in the 1960s, and they were like, God is dead, all is permitted, and they ran around and got STDs. Marx changes the way people in the West think about capital, money, right? And again, all these guys, I'm not saying we should swallow everything that they put out. I'm saying that they were tremendously important and significant. I happen not to be a Marxist myself, unlike many of my colleagues. I'm a good old-fashioned bloody capitalist. But I think that if you want to argue against Marx, if you want to refute Marx, you should have read a little Marx, right? I've read the Communist Manifesto. It's very short. You can read it pretty quickly. I've read pieces of Das Kapital, which is massive, like 4 volumes, I believe 4 volumes, of how wealth works in nation states in the 19th century. The point I'm making here is Derrida says these men create a rift between the world that had existed in the 19th century and modernity, the 20th century. So there is a movement that steps into this rift in the first half of the 20th century, and that movement is in the arts, it's in literature, it's in paintings and sculpture and architecture and music, and I'm talking about modernism. And the dates for this kind of stuff, right? They're always kind of blurry. You can look at certain writers in the late 19th century and say that they're modernists. We're having technical difficulties here in the classroom. We have a missing AirPod.
Yeah, it's under your.
All right, got it all sorted out. So we'll say for our purposes here, 1910 to 1960. Now, there are people who are still working, writers, painters, sculptors, architects, still working in the modernist tradition into the 80s and 90s. And I would argue that Cormac McCarthy wrote in the modernist tradition until he died. Philip Myers' The Sun is published in 2013, is thoroughly in the modernist tradition. In fact, I think all the books that we've read, and we'll read except for the DFW, are in that modernist tradition. I'll describe what this means. Some people have it starting way earlier. People argue Moby Dick, which is published 1850-51, as a modernist text. So, what is, and we'll deal with the literary part of modernism. Literary modernism called for a new way of seeing reality and representing reality. Modernism very much believes in truth with a capital T. It very much believes in core, what they would call core human values. But they believe the means by which novelists, writers, poets, painters were representing humanity on the page, etc., were broken and no longer contained the power to affect an audience. So, one of the producers, and I mean almost literally a producer of literary modernism, the poet and critic Ezra Pound, has this famous modernist kind of motto, make it new. So it's not a rejection of emotions, beliefs, and values. It's a desire to find new forms of expression to convey those emotions, beliefs, and values. So if we're going to talk about modernist poets, the most famous of them, have you read T.S. Eliot? T.S. Eliot is this massively famous modernist poet. And not only is he writing poetry in this tradition, he's actively thinking about modernism as a movement. And I'm creating poetry in this tradition, and I'm creating poetry that speaks to this tradition. He's also writing criticism where he puts forward modernist readings of Shakespeare, particularly Hamlet, essay called Hamlet and His Problems. So T.S. Eliot, William Butler Yeats, Eliot's big poem, his modernist manifesto in verse, is The Wasteland. He's trying to replicate in poetry what James Joyce did with Ulysses, about which more later. In America, Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens. You can definitely put Hilda Doolittle in there. This poetry, Ezra Pound, this poetry is allusive in that it alludes to other works of art and literature. If you've read The Wasteland or The Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock, you know that Eliot will take lines of Shakespeare and reappropriate them, right? Eliot will take bits of Dante's Divine Comedy and insert them, not even translate them, just insert them. So he'll repurpose work from other artists and use them as literary allusions. And it's that kind of, for Eliot, that kind of pasting together, this kind of building that creates this modernist artifact. In fiction, the big names for modernist fiction are the Irish writer James Joyce, and he's most famous for Ulysses. Ulysses is the story of a Dubliner who has Hungarian Jewish ancestry named Leopold Bloom, and it's set on June 16th, 1904, and in Ulysses, we just follow Leopold Bloom around the city. We also follow a young man named Stephen Dedalus, who Bloom kind of becomes a surrogate father to. And we follow a little bit Bloom's wife, Molly Bloom. What is number of revolutionary things about Ulysses. As a modernist text, what's interesting is that Ulysses is a retelling of the Odyssey, right? But Joyce begins to ask, what would Odysseus be like in 1904 Dublin, right? And he decides, well, Odysseus is an ad salesman. Right? He works for a newspaper and canvasses for ads, and he goes around and, what is heroic in 1904 Dublin? Is it like you go slay the Cyclops? It's like, no, you go confront an Irish nationalist in a pub, right? So every chapter of Ulysses corresponds to an episode of the Odyssey, right? You have Telemachus and Nestor and Proteus, Calypso, the Lotus Eaters, Hades, Cyclops, Scylla and Charybdis, all that kind of stuff. But they're pitched in this different way. And it all takes place in the course of less than 24 hours. It's one day, June 16th, and a little bit into June 17th. And each chapter is in a different form, right? So in the chapter called Aeolus, which takes place in a newspaper office, the headlines from the paper leap out on the page and become sort of characters. In the Cyclops chapter, Joyce writes each new paragraph in a different style to indicate gigantism. In Oxen of the Sun, the chapter starts, there's a woman, she's giving birth in a maternity ward. The characters Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus are kind of sitting in a waiting room, and they're kind of talking about this. And the chapter starts in pre-Latin, is written in pre-English kind of Latinate, and then goes through all the phases of English up to the present moment. So you have a paragraph written in Arthurian English, right? And you have a paragraph written in Chaucerian English, and then you go up through the Elizabethan period, and each paragraph is a parody of writers in that, quote, evolution of English, right? So Joyce is finding these new forms, formal ways of expressing old truths and old human stories. And also, the allusion is important to this, A-L-L, and mythology is important to this. With many of the modernists, you see a repurposing of myth in various ways. So, James Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf is massively important. She's most famous for To the Lighthouse, probably, and Mrs. Dalloway. Interestingly, Ulysses becomes so famous and is seen as the greatest novel of the 20th century by most people, right? Because it's banned. Like, it does all this interesting stuff, but it represents all the things that weren't represented in novels before that time, at least in literary novels. Leopold Bloom goes to the bathroom in the morning. We see him on the toilet, right? We see him thinking and puzzling through stuff while he defecates. We see Stephen urinating on the beach. We hear people frankly discussing sexuality. Bloom's wife, Molly, closes the book with a monologue, and she's talking about sex in this really frank, and to a lot of people's mind, vulgar way. So Ulysses is banned and censored in the UK. It's censored in America. The US Post Office seizes all these copies of Ulysses and burns them. This is kind of like difficult to wrap your head around, right? There were people in the 1920s in America who made a fortune pirating copies of Ulysses. There are people who made money smuggling copies of Ulysses into the country. Now, that is a strange idea when you can't give away books to people now, right? But Ulysses had been ruled obscene, right? Of course, what happens when you censor something, when you ban it, and when you rule it obscene? People want it, right? That's what I would say to all the people who censor on the right, the left, the middle, the whatever. If you want to ensure a book's or a film's or a whatever's success, censor it, ban it. And there's nothing that's more interesting than authority saying, do not look at this, do not read this, don't watch this film, don't play this video game, don't read this book, right? So Ulysses is censored in the UK and the United States. And then in 1933, this went to the circuit courts, right? And a judge named Woolsey wrote this very famous decision. It's actually reprinted at the beginning of a lot of different copies of Ulysses, where he's like, you can tell, like, he's a smart guy. He's a judge. He's kind of like more kind of a conservative in the way he thinks about the world. But he goes and reads Ulysses, right? And he's like, yeah, I think this book is difficult, but Joyce is tremendously skilled. And it seems clear to me that this is not obscene or prurient in the usual sense. It's not pornographic in the way we normally think of pornography. So Ulysses is ruled not obscene, and then it becomes a bestseller in the United States, which is a crazy thing because it's a very, very difficult book for most educated readers to get through. It's challenging in all these different ways. So I bring up Ulysses again because Virginia Woolf reads parts of Ulysses, and she's offended by it. It's pretty interesting. The blasphemy, the book has passages which some people consider blasphemous. That doesn't concern her, but she really hates like all the stuff of Leopold Bloom in the outhouse defecating, right? She really hates all the like frank discussion of sexuality. It really bothers her. And she also, Joyce invents, or kind of borrows, this technique he calls stream of consciousness, where we get into a character's head on the page, and he tries to represent in language how and what someone is thinking. And Woolf tries to read the book. She can't read the book, doesn't like it. And then T.S. Eliot visits her, and he's like, this is a really important novel. Like, even if it offends you, you ought to read it because Joyce is up to some interesting stuff. So Woolf reads it again, and she's still offended, but also she's like, I don't think human consciousness works quite this way. I think Joyce gets it wrong with the stream of consciousness. And she thinks about that and then does kind of her own Ulysses, right? Which is Mrs. Dalloway. It's not based on Ulysses, but she develops her stream of consciousness technique thinking about what Joyce does, right? If you haven't read Mrs. Dalloway, it's a beautiful book, an interesting book. It gets into the interior lives of several different women, and also a World War I veteran with PTSD who commits suicide. So you have all these really interesting things going on. The modernists are also responding to this apocalypse that had happened from 1914 to 1918, the First World War. It's very difficult for us to understand the level of death, suffering, calamity those people saw, right? They were still using chlorine gas. You know, most of the things that have been banned by the Geneva Convention were done in World War I. It's the first war where you had airplanes, right? Primitive, but you had some kind of bombing. You had the first use, concentrated use of machine gun fire. You had the first use of tanks. At the Battle of Ypres in France, the lines were very close. So many people died that there were 1,000 bodies per square foot. Like, you could walk from one side of the battlefield to the other just stepping on corpses, right? That kind of calamity, that kind of apocalypse, people in the UK and Great Britain, they saw basically an entire generation of men vanish. And then those who came back were hollow, right? Were hollowed by the trauma they'd witnessed. And so you see a lot of modernists responding to that, right? Eliot responds to this. If we've witnessed these horrors, how do we continue to lead a meaningful life? How can we have a coherent society, a coherent culture or civilization after we've witnessed the horrors of World War I? And so you see modernists responding to that. In America, William Faulkner, the big modernist text from him, Sound and the Fury. He's using techniques similar to what Joyce uses, right? And then you can't ever get away from Hemingway's influence. The interesting thing about Hemingway is he's just a little older than you guys when he he was an ambulance driver in World War I, right? He comes back home and then he goes abroad. He's like in his mid-20s and he's starting to write. In Paris at the time, Hemingway could get up, go to a cafe, talk to Ford Madox Ford and Wyndham Lewis, go over to Gertrude Stein's house, hang out with her and Alice B. Toklas, right? Go over to James Joyce's that evening, right? Have drinks with Joyce, and accompany Joyce to the bar. Hemingway says that Joyce would start fights, and then he would say, "Finish it, him," right? And so Hemingway had to, because Hemingway could actually box, and then he would give Ezra Pound boxing lessons, and talk with Tia, right? So it's like the most insane workshop, creative writing workshop anyone's ever had. And he benefited from all these people. He was a very good student. He was very intent. He was a very hard worker. And he creates a new prose style. The style of Cormac McCarthy, the style of most modern writers, is so thoroughly influenced by Hemingway, right? With a pared down prose, a prose that like seeks to evoke sense and sense memory, and is often seen as deceptively simple. Hemingway's sentences are sometimes, this is not in every book, but are often like short, declarative, concrete, get right at the thing. And you realize that the accumulation of all that creates this rich experience, right? So other F. Scott Fitzgerald, obviously Ford Madox Ford in Great Britain, E.M. Forster, Great Britain. So the modernists decide that they're going to make it new. Joyce found new forms for the novel in Ulysses. Hemingway creates this new lean prose style. Woolf found new ways of depicting human consciousness into The Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. Faulkner found new voices and ways of representing them on the page, and As I Die, The Sound and the Fury. The idea that was shared by the modernists was that human experience could be captured in language and transmitted to the reader. Not only could that experience be given to the reader, but fundamental truths about being human on this planet could be revealed. There was also this sense that modernists believed, and modernists in every discipline, in literary arts, in painting, sculpture, film, music, they believed that with enough time and enough skill and work, the totality of human experience could be represented. Just as the scientists of the day believed that with enough time, finely calibrated enough instruments, the right technology, everything about the material universe could be discovered, all of its workings could be tracked. That was that moment. People believed that there could be a totality that could be expressed, captured, quantified, represented, et cetera, right? That is in opposition to how scientists think now, right? Chaos theorists, scientists of complexity, they don't believe that even with all the time in the world, even with super advanced technology, even with the most finely calibrated instruments, there are things that we're not going to know. And there are systems that are going to frustrate our ability to categorize, right? So that's a shift from modernism to postmodernism. I'll get to in a second. Okay, so modernism is the art and the literature that come out of the first half of the 20th century. The school of criticism that is used to interpret modernism is known as new criticism, right? Especially in the United States, people like Clint Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, Lytle, et cetera. New criticism emphasized close reading, right? So there was a reaction against what was called old historicism, where if you were taking a literature class, you'd walk into class and a professor would just talk about the context of a work. If you're reading like Hamlet, the professor might talk about the history of Denmark. The professor might talk about the Elizabethan England of Shakespeare's day, et cetera, et cetera. And you did very little work with the play itself, right? New critics were the opposite. They didn't want to hear about the author's biography. They didn't want to hear about the historical context. They only focused on the text, right? There are famous examples of professors of poetry who were new critics who would like Xerox poems and then they would cut the author's name off, right? Because they just wanted their students to, I mean, this is obviously extreme, right? They just wanted their students to interact with the words on the page. It's like, well, if you don't know the allusion, you're not smart enough. If you need a dictionary, you're not smart enough. Now, there are a lot of benefits to a new critical approach, like the close reading thing. Of course, like, I don't know about you guys, but I don't speak Greek and Latin, right? If you're gonna read Eliot, you're gonna have untranslated Greek and Latin, untranslated Italian, right? It's nice to have footnotes, right? The new critics kind of rejected that approach. And of course, like everyone, they took things too far. So new criticism is the critical approach. And then the theoretical approach, scientific and linguistic, is called structuralism. Now we're getting toward what I want to talk about. Structuralism was a cultural and linguistic anthropological approach to interpreting human culture, right? And structuralism argued that the kinds of works created by modernism and the modernists themselves could be processed and analyzed empirically, right? The father of this is a Swiss linguist named Ferdinand Saussure. Now, Saussure wasn't around for the big structuralist movement. People adopted his ideas and ran with his ideas after his death. I think 1913 is when he died. Okay, a big name in structuralism in the 40s and 50s is a French, I believe he's French, structuralist named Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he's interested in breaking all of these things down. The structuralism would capture the linguistic codes, interpret the myths, and the anthropology of modernism. Now, crucial to all this is, of course, language itself. So, the one thing I want you to remember about the structuralist stuff is this thing I'm going to outline here. So, Saussure comes up with these ideas about what language actually is. And we're back to a little bit with Universal Kitty and Plato, right? This is a lopsided world I'm drawing. Boy, that's how I feel today, too. So you remember how we had, like, the chair is the idea of chair. It's eternal, it's unchanging. Plato's not approaching those things linguistically. He's approaching them more conceptually, right? And then if I paint the chair on Earth, the chair is already a copy because I'm copying the physical chair from the idea of chair. Okay, so here's how Saussure would approach this. He would say you have the word chair, and the word chair is bound to the concept of chair. Okay, so chair as concept, chair as word, right? I should put this in quotation marks. He calls this part the signifier. This is the kind of thing that will be on the final. And this part, the signified. And all of this together, the signifier and the signified, are what Saussure and those after him are interested in his ideas call the sign. The sign is made of signifier and signified. So we have the sound of the word, what Saussure calls the acoustic image, the sound of the word chair, and that is bound up inside the sign with the concept of chair. That thing which has 4 legs, I know, this is tough stuff, 4 legs, a back, and a seat, all right? If it has 3 legs, a seat, and no back, it is a, right, that's the stoolness of the stool. Now, enter post-structuralism. Post-structuralists become suspicious of these things. And post-structuralism starts off as a critique of structuralism and then branches off to this thing we call postmodernism and some of the ideas we have floating around today. Now, several of the most prominent post-structuralists started their careers as French structuralists. I'm thinking of Roland Barthes. I'm thinking of Derrida, right? I'm thinking of the psychiatrist, post-structuralist psychiatrist Lacan. And they say that there's this weird thing that happens with signifier and signified. In the late 60s, Jacques Derrida notes that, and this is probably correct. He notes that there is no inherent chairness in the word chair. Right? He notes that the word chair has been arbitrarily assigned to chair, right? And that the English word chair might be similar to other words. Why wasn't chair called chimney? How did chimney come to be associated with that thing? And even if you go into like etymology and you're like, okay, well, this word comes from this word, which comes from this word, you still can't quite explain why any particular object, process, thing, whatever it might be, is associated with the word it's associated with, right? So the sound of the word chair does not bear any inherent or essential relationship to the concept of chair. Okay, so that seems pretty, it's like, okay, good point, all right? Also, so what? Well, Derrida then goes on to say, if that is true, if there's, and this is a big word for him, right? He calls the fact that there's not this connection, he calls this slippage. If there is this slippage between the signified, the concept of chair, and the word chair, well, maybe there are other slippages in terms of meaning. Yes? Like what?
Like toaster. It's
toaster.
Really bad because it toasts things. So it does have
okay.
toasterness.
All right. Think about this though, right? Okay, let's start with toast.
So that's what I thought you were gonna say. Yeah. I know, but like, okay, you just go.
No. It's a great question, right? Toaster toasts bread and is therefore a toaster. But the sound of that word, right? Toasted. It could easily be called roasted, right? At some point, an arbitrary assignment of sound of this word to concept or thing was made. We don't know why that was made, how that came to be. If you think about how slang comes to be, right? Someone says a thing, and then it kind of like other people kind of you repeat it, and it has a vibe. Has a vibe to it, right? And people like it, and then this is kind of perfect, right? That word loses its currency, and you don't say it after a while. Like about a year ago, based and cringe were very big, right? You were based or you were cringe. Okay, it is now kind of cringe to call things based. It's like, oh, that's so 2021, right? Based has begun to lose its currency. And what's that?
Basic?
No, based.
It's like you're like right, kind of.
You haven't heard based? How many of you have not heard based? It's only a few. Based is like, could you tell? Now this is so deconstructive, actually, right? Now we're back to the baseness of the based. Like, what does it mean to be based?
Like right, like you're right. Like if you get an argument with someone over like sports or something, and you're right, the person tries to like based.
Yeah, but you're also like, you don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it is. It's like Honey Badger don't give a fuck. Honey Badger is based. He's going to do what he has to do. So if you go ahead and you say the thing, you say the true thing, right? Without regard for consequences, whoa, that's based, right? There's a kind of like flipping the middle finger, right? And then cringe is like you're being too genuine or sincere. It's just like, ugh. Or you're using words in a way that just like, right? You're saying something that just makes people kind of recoil. But these things kind of fall apart after a while. Based can lose its currency. It's interesting that cool has kind of kept its currency.
Yeah, I think cool.
It's, pretty interesting, right? But all these words come in and out of favor. I feel like if you were to call something rad, people would look at you. What are you talking about? That some of you didn't know about based is interesting. I feel like that's a very terminally online kind of. Yeah, it's very terminally online behavior to call all this. So Plato, by the way, is addressing these concepts, this chairness of chair. Again, he's addressing these ideas, this way of thinking conceptually as opposed to linguistically. Poststructuralists are pointing out there's no inherent chairness in the sound of the word chair, right, as a concept. It's arbitrary, it could easily be something else. And if, as poststructuralists believe, that if you point out how arbitrary the sign, signifier and signified, are, there's a slippage and the concepts lose currency and these things fall apart. If they're lying to us about the words, what else are they lying to us about? Now, the major figures of post-structuralism are almost entirely French. They're almost entirely of the radical left at the time. Not the radical left now, but what was radical and leftist at that particular moment. So, deal with a couple of these guys. Probably, I don't want to say the most important, but the figure of post-structuralism that made the biggest splash in the literary world in terms of literary theory is Jacques Derrida. And like someone else I'll talk about in a second, Foucault, Derrida was red-pilled in Paris during the student protests in 1968, right? These protests were informed by the protests that were happening in the United States, many on college campuses, against the Vietnam War. There were these protests and riots, et cetera, in 1968, and a number of these people who became prominent in post-structuralism were, young intellectuals, professors, et cetera, who attended those protests and began to see their work, their linguistic or critical work, in the framework of a radical opposition to the conservatism of that day. We would read all these signs differently now. So, Derrida says that language bears within itself the necessity of its own critique. His point is that the word he invents, the verb deconstruct, and the process of doing this deconstruction, this is something that language does in and of itself. An interesting example is when you said basic. You thought I was saying basic instead of based. What does basic refer to now? Like, what's basic slang for?
Like we're just ordinary.
You're just ordinary, right? Kids will say, "Oh, that's if you get your pumpkin. If you get your pumpkin spice latte and you're wearing your Ugg boots with your yoga pants, like you're a quote basic bitch, right? You're just basic, right? And there's not a large linguistic leap from based to basic. The concepts couldn't be more different. But again, we're at the arbitrariness of the sign. So Derrida's major contribution to this whole conversation, at least for our purposes, is that idea of deconstruction. And the verb deconstruct. We're back to where we started. Okay. Deconstruction is an interpretive strategy. It's a way of making meaning out of a text, and also a more active way of processing reading. I'm not saying it's a good thing to do, but I'm just saying this is what it is. Here's how you deconstruct a particular text. And that text can be a poem on a page, it can be a novel, it can be a video game, it can be a film, it can be a television series. Derrida would famously say, people interpret it this different ways, there is nothing outside of the text. So another way of saying, there is only text, right? And then we are interpreters. You probably argue that we're also text. But if you start with something simple, like a tweet, right? You just take those words on the page, and the first thing you do is you go through and you find the binaries. Okay. You guys can think of a billion of these once I put you on the trail. The most familiar binaries in our culture are give me some more now. Up, down, light, dark, what else? Hot, cold. Give me some more. True or false. What else? Great one. What's that?
Close and far.
Yes. Now, particularly in America, fast, slow is one. Good and bad, keep going, right? And these can be as broad and elemental or as politically charged, right? If you get into white and black, that's a politically charged binary. If you get into gay and straight and gay, that's a politically charged binary. If you get into documented and undocumented, that's a politically charged binary, right? You can keep going with all these various things. So the first thing you do with the text is you identify the various binaries, right? Part two is you decide which one of those binaries the text is privileging. Why can't I spell privileging?
E-L. Oh yeah, I-G.
Well, so it's not just me who can't spell privileging.
Yeah, I-L-D-D.
Good grief. I know what. I'm on the wrong side of the dumb smart. Which one is the text privileging? All right? So in a particular text in America in 2023, you can read a particular tweet from a particular lawmaker and be like, okay, I see where we're going, right? White is being privileged over black, right? Light is being privileged over dark. Straight is being privileged over gay, right? All this kind of cis is being privileged over trans, right? You're looking at kind of thinking a little bit about the intent and how the words operate in a particular text. So you identify the binaries, you determine which is the privileged term. The third part is this. I can't deal with it. I can't have it.
I-L-G.
Thank you. Which is the privileged term? Then you place the privileged term under erasure, right? Here's what that means. If you have a tweet from a politician that privileges white over black, straight over gay, cis over trans, documented or undocumented, et cetera, right? You determine which is the privileged term. You place that under erasure. Then you reread the text as though the non-privileged term was the privileged term, right? This is why it's important that Derrida says, why he creates the word deconstruct. You're not destroying something. You're not constructing something. You're taking something apart and rebuilding it in a particular way to make meaning. This is why when you're on the news and someone says, well, let's get into and deconstruct this. Not what you mean. You don't mean deconstruct. You just mean let's interpret. Deconstruction is a very particular kind of radical, subversive interpretation. Not saying it's good to do. I'm just saying this is what it is. All right? We'll talk more about deconstruction once we get into DFW's book. We'll talk about how specifically it works, what it does. Often you have narratives that are created that are deconstructions of a particular kind of narrative, right? So people have called Blood Meridian, I don't know if this is exactly true, but people have argued that Blood Meridian is a postmodern Western and it is a deconstructive Western, right? Where you take the idea that you're gonna link up with the posse and, save the whatever people. Well, you link up with the posse and you go around and you murder them, right? And so in every binary, Blood Meridian flips the term, privileges the other thing, privileges dark over light, privileges, quote, savagery over civilization, et cetera, right? Even the person who is the judge is not judging like a moral judge, right. So that is and Derrida writes tons of books, has plenty of different concepts. They're all difficult. They're all difficult to grasp. He's not the clearest writer. Now, another prominent post-structuralist who sort of Derrida approaches this as a linguist, as someone who's explicating the Kabbalah, and then other texts from that. Michel Foucault is approaching this as a cultural historian, right? And he's French at the 1968 Paris protests, becomes radicalized, was a structuralist, but sees the slippage that Derrida talks about, right? And then begins to apply those things to cultural institutions. One of his big areas is the idea of what punishment is in the West, and his idea of the panopticon. He wrote a book called Discipline and Punish, which talks about the various ways that punishment was meted out by the state in 18th century and 19th century France, right? For Foucault, the good old days is when they took a prisoner to the town square and drew and quartered him. Those are the good old days. Foucault's like, now we do something that's more ominous and more sinister, right? So for Foucault, a big part of the state apparatus of punishment has to do with the way prisons are constructed, right? So there's a particular kind of prison that Foucault references where it's like the circular system and the cells are on either side, but the guard tower is like up in the middle, like the cells like go around the cylindrical structure. And the guard tower and the guard platform is in the center, right? So the guards in their room in the center can look around 360 degrees and see all of the inmates, right? There's no place inmates can get that they're not being surveilled. Now, Foucault talks about the ingenuity of this design and how ultimately sinister it is. And for him, one of the sinister things is if the guard tower has like mirrored windows, right? You don't know whether the guards are watching you or not. Maybe there are no guards in the tower. Maybe it's just the presence of the tower. And the presence of the panopticon, right? You can view from every, right? You can pan, opta, eye, changes our behavior, changes the behavior of the prisoners. Now, you guys know this intimately. Now that everyone has video cameras on their phone, now that there are all these like video cameras all over, you've probably noticed ways in which your own behavior is governed by that. Right? You're like, well, I don't want to do that. I don't know if I'm on video or not. I don't know if I'm being filmed. And particularly in this day of like videoing a stranger and putting it online and that going viral, right? That definitely, like during 2020, when there were a rash of like Karen videos, right? There was a new one, and this person will be blasted out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, et cetera, and then surely people began to think, "Ooh, gosh, I don't want to end up being racist on YouTube and TikTok, right? I'm going to modify my behavior." Now, are people filming me or not? I don't know, right? What I started saying a long time ago, as soon as all this stuff came to the fore, technology, it was like, just assume you're being recorded, assume you're being filmed, right? That is, to Foucault, that's the panopticon at work, right? And that's the thing Foucault wants to resist. Foucault is also really interested in ideas of how power is mediated, how power is acquired and maintained, how people hold on to their power. For him, there is not what Derrida calls a transcendental signified. There is no God, there is no truth, there is no ultimate signified that exists that we can fix our ideas to. there's only a nexus of power and power relationships. Now, I don't like that idea very much at all, but it's been an extraordinarily influential idea, right? There isn't good and evil, there's just power, right? And you have human beings functioning in a particular way to seize, increase, take power, and then not to lose it. Now, Foucault is forming these ideas in relation to a government, the French government at the time, that he saw at least as being tyrannical, or as he saw as intruding on personal liberty. A lot of these French post-structuralists are enamored with an idea of some kind of total liberty. This is because for them, there is not this transcendent signifier that existed for writers in the 19th century, that existed before what Derrida calls the rupture, right? Now, so post-structuralism is what is going on in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in literary criticism and art and film criticism and critical studies, et cetera, et cetera. The literary arm of that and the actual art that is produced, novels, films, painting, poetry, sculpture, et cetera, is postmodernism, responding to all the tenets of modernism. Many postmodernists are interested in deconstructing traditional narratives, questioning power relationships, subverting and inverting narratives. So, among novelists, you have Robert Coover, Kathy Acker, Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, John Hawkes, and a writer who's younger and is absorbing these things and really comes into his own in the 90s, David Foster Wallace. Interesting thing about Wallace is he's one of the first fiction writers who's writing, postmodernist literature or responding to postmodernist and poststructuralist ideas, who's really absorbed the body of critical literature that is critiquing this art movement, right? He's well-versed in Derrida, in Lyotard, in Lacan, in Foucault. Like, he knows all this stuff, and he has this training in philosophy and this grounding in that. So you can see in his fictions, in his short stories, in his novels, and his novellas, you can see him playing with ideas. Now, for next time when we look at something to do with paying attention, I want you to be on the lookout for ideas and themes about surveillance, right? Which take us back to Foucault's panopticon. I want you to be on the lookout for ideas about bureaucracy and power, which take us back to Foucault's ideas about knowledge and power. And I want you to be on the lookout for ideas about boredom and meaning. This novella we're going to read is set in an IRS office, right? You would think could be nothing more boring than taxes and IRS agents. No offense, IRS, if you're listening, right? So David Foster Wallace is interested in all these ideas. Now, do you guys have there's a lot of stuff to throw at you. Do you guys have questions about any of this or comments? Sir?
So is post-structuralism necessarily come before postmodernism? Like the first postmodern novel? Because
okay, so here's the thing, right? Post-structuralism, and don't put your stuff away yet, we've still got 5 minutes. Post-structuralism is identifying trends in the culture and creating a body of beliefs about the culture, a body of ideas it's interested in, and we'll go back and sort of what do you call it when they retroactively mess with a text? They retcon, they retcon Nabokov, right? So let's say, well, you can see that Pale Fire is actually a very deconstructive novel. Or they'll retcon Day of the Locust. And they'll say, oh, you can actually see these ideas being played out in the early 20th century. Now, you don't have to be a postmodernist novelist to write a work of postmodern literature, right? Maybe, you're dealing with themes that the postmodernists and poststructuralists become interested in. It's a great question. And so there are the unself-conscious postmodernists, people who aren't necessarily reading post-structuralist theory and postmodernist theory, who are creating art that respond to this moment in literary and art history, right? And they're like, oh, if you look at the films of David Lynch, they're often talked about very much in the tradition of postmodernism, where meaning is breaking down, where the narrative doesn't cohere in ways we would think traditional narratives do. Sir?
So I actually I have two questions, but I'll just ask this one. So about the slippage and stuff, like what exactly does a word have then that's not arbitrary? Could you give me an example of a word that isn't arbitrary reason to be there? So does that mean every word is arbitrary?
The argument is every word is arbitrarily, okay. Every object that is named is arbitrarily linked to the acoustic image that's been assigned to it. Now, by the way, poststructuralists aren't conspiratorial about this. They don't think some cabal of people in suits in a boardroom have done this. To use a phrase from Paul Demond, it's always already there. These words exist. We don't know who came up with them. We don't know who the progenitors are. It'd be interesting to track down the person who started using based to mean a particular kind of being cool, right? We don't know. It's always already there, right? So they would say that the marrying of the concept to the acoustic image, right, to the sound of the word is arbitrary. And then they will say, if that, then this, right? If that linkage, if that marriage is arbitrary, what else is arbitrary? Can truth be arbitrary? Can love be arbitrary? Can et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The dynamics and relationships of power. Other questions? All right, I will see you next time with some David Foster Wallace.